Good afternoon, evening, middle of the night, depending on where you are. I'm Dmitri Glinski. I'm humbled to welcome our highly distinguished speakers and all of you from 3 continents on behalf of our association, ARA, a network of exiles and refugees from former Soviet countries and their friends and allies, working since 2012 from coast to coast, raising public awareness, building bridges between communities, and adding our voices and our accents to international debates on Ukraine and Russia and on human rights and democracy. Since moving most our events online 4.5 years ago, we've held 27 roundtables like this with speakers and participants from over 20 countries, including human rights defenders from both Ukraine and Russia, and all the way to Brazil and New Zealand. And of course, as a disclaimer goes, the opinions expressed here are strictly personal and do not necessarily reflect the views of our organization or yours. This includes my opinions too. Every year in May, we aim to bring into conversation some element of the legacy of Andrei Sakharov and the human rights movement around him. The starting point for our today's discussion are his warnings about the promoters of the Kremlin's expansion that, as he wrote, had inundated the West and developing countries, and about their threat to democracy's unity in response to that expansion. That quotation from his article is in our event's description in exact translation from Russian, as the New York Times version, when it was published, was considerably softened. And I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that what he was writing about was not just military expansion, but the expansion of the Kremlin's mode of governance by military and many other means. And even though today's Russia's standing in the world and its internal condition are qualitatively different, I would even say pitiful in comparison with the USSR 40 years ago, its yearning for global expansion is plain to see, both in the Kremlin and in the privileged layers of its society, its corporate and security establishment. And I'd argue that its ultimate goals are ideological and political, that is to help bring to power in key Western countries anti-liberal forces and help sustain them in power, so that autocratic Russia, with all its brutality towards its own people and its neighbors, does not look too bad in comparison, and so that liberal democracy is no longer a viable alternative in the minds of Russian dissenters and would-be future dissenters. So there is an underlying ideological motivation, at times even I would say fervor, which is anti-liberal at its core. Like in Soviet times, only back then its foreign base, so to speak, was mainly on the left, while today it's mainly on the right, especially the far right, which is also becoming not so far as it gets normalized through success at the polls. In some ways, this is a reversal to the Tsarist Russia, whose main foreign allies were also on the right wing of Western societies. And as far back as around the time of 1848 revolutions in Western Europe, Imperial Russia was providing material support to right-wing periodicals all the way to France. Just as in Soviet times, there are supporters of this agenda in the West driven by beliefs, this time mainly conservative beliefs, that, as Sakharov put in that article, merit discussion. And on the other end, at the higher level of Western societies, the Kremlin has weaponized corruption like its predecessors tried to do. This is a remarkable degree of continuity, in my view, given all the geopolitical and technological changes around us. Speaking of some of the differences brought about by the age of globalization, one of them I'd like to emphasize is the blurring of identity boundaries between Russia and Kremlin-affiliated agentura on one hand, and the non-Russian, Western-bred promoters of its agendas. Dual and even transnational identities juggling positions of influence in more than one system. One glaring example of this is the father and son Lebedevs. The father, Alexander Lebedev, former Soviet intelligence official in London, then a hardline member of the Russian Duma and a media magnate in both Moscow and London, currently under Canadian and Ukrainian sanctions only. His son, Yevgeny Lebedev, is a media magnate in the United Kingdom, the likely future successor to his father as owner of his Russian media, and also the only Russian-born member of the House of Lords, though quite a few Soviet and Russian dissident emigres might have been better qualified for this high honor, something that would be quite unthinkable in Soviet times. Now, I'd like to share with you a bit from my previous writings on the post-Soviet Russia impact on democracies, which I sought to explore back in my early 30s while still in academia before leaving it for nonprofit work and community organizing. In 2001, the program on new approaches to Russian security, PONERS, that was based at Harvard at the time, under its founder, distinguished scholar and public servant Celeste Wallander, published my policy memo titled Suffocation by Embrace, the Putin-Bush Alliance and the Cultural Threat to Western Democracy. That was shortly after President Bush stated that he had looked into Putin's eyes and found him trustworthy. In my essay, I wrote in particular about, quote, Putin's encouragement of Western hardliners, which I argued, quote, increasingly look like the mirror image of the early Bolshevik ideological operations in the West. While Bolshevik emissaries worked to divide and to subvert Western societies by radicalizing the left, Putin and his cohorts may be doing just the same, only this time on the right flank of a Western political spectrum. I wrote that this represents, quote, political and cultural challenge to the very foundations of the international democratic community. His interests and policy actions point toward influencing the fundamentals of the Western political order and value system. This may be done by fueling and indefinitely extending the state of conflict and thus spreading the culture of emergency based on the sense of an ever-present threat that justifies a long-term abandonment of democratic and human rights standards, end of quote. And finally, in 2003, in a book that I edited and produced on the basis of a conference that we had co-organized in Moscow with Boris Kagarlitsky, my colleague back then and now a political prisoner brutally jailed by the Putin dictatorship for his anti-war remarks, and he is jailed in spite of his advanced age and international recognition. Our book with articles by Boris and other scholars was published by the Moscow office of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, and you can now find it on the Internet Archive online. In that book, I wrote about the infiltration of the upper class of democratic societies by Russian kleptocrats, quote, the project of convergence of the two societies that Sakharov and others advocated for was ditched in favor of the convergence of elites. On the Russian side, this meant a speedy integration of the corrupt and authoritarian nomenclatura networks into the international economy through the rapid-fire privatization, with subsequent asset stripping and capital export to the West at the expense of most of the country's population. On their part, Western participants in this process happily collaborated and normalized their rapacious and lawless transformation into corporate owners and accepted them as legitimate partners at the risk of a fundamental destabilization of the value system of democratic societies and of compromising the institutions of liberal democracy. End of quote. Now, the influence channels of the autocratic and imperial Russia in the West have always operated at the expense of Russia's dissenters and their alternative democratic and anti-imperial visions. In Soviet times, institutions like the London School of Economics could deny their space to the organizers of the Sakharov hearing as being too controversial. In this century, the patterns of hiring, promotion, and funding in Russia-related NGOs and research centers in the West have too often favored the exporters of Soviet-era wealth and privilege over political exiles and refugees from the regime who have never enjoyed the same opportunities and inclusion. Part of the reason, I believe, is that the Kremlin-connected wealth and privilege were able to buy Western-style coaching for its promoters, so that some of the graduates of Soviet intelligence trainings were coming to the West flawlessly polished in the corporate lingo and knowing what to say in order to blend into the circles that they needed, while dissident emigres, even though they had an edge in the substance of what they had to say, were never trained to please those high-powered audiences that prioritize appearance. Thus, no former Soviet or Russian pro-democracy exile ever gained any positions of real influence in Western or international NGOs, let alone government agencies, except those that they set up for themselves. Speaking from personal observations, in South Brooklyn, where a sizable part of the post-Soviet emigre community resides, senior-level roles in relevant service agencies are more likely to be held by those who had been visiting the Kremlin in the years preceding the war, as part of the delegations of the so-called compatriots parading their loyalty. In contrast, you won't find any dissidents or anti-war community organizers in these roles. And the channels of Kremlin influence in the US have always been bipartisan. Thus, in New York's mayor's office, under a mayor who was elected as a Democrat, someone who had served as a public promoter of some of the Russian oligarchs, including those currently under sanctions, US sanctions, can serve as a senior-level official in City Hall. And in my own part of the city, where every single elected official is a Democrat, there is an NGO that was openly funded by the Russian Foreign Ministry and aggressively promoting its agenda. And that group for years enjoyed privileged access as compared to pro-democracy and anti-war exiles. Now, in the subtitle of today's event, you can see the word hearing. So we decided to call it a hearing, even though there is no jury and no verdict to be pronounced. It is a reminder and a reference to the series of Andrei Sakharov hearings that were launched 50 years ago in Copenhagen and were held from 1975 to 1985 in 5 capitals of the democratic world. with participation of some of the cultural giants of the time, from Simon Wiesenthal to Eugene Ionescu. And I'm truly honored that we have here today two of the participants of these hearings. First, Andrew Grigorenko, who served as a witness at the very first one in Copenhagen, a witness on Crimean Tatars and repression against Crimean Tatars, and Mario Corti, the key organizer of the second hearing in Rome in 1977 and co-organizer of the third hearing in Washington. We are not claiming to revive these hearings today, let alone present ourselves as a jury questioning witnesses. Nor do I believe that these hearings can be resurrected as such by someone else. And that's not just because you can't enter the same river twice. They were closely tied to Sakharov's own activities. They were guided by his directly expressed vision. Their purpose was to publicize and to examine the Soviet human rights violations at a time when Western audiences were still largely uninformed about them. The logic of those hearings was grounded in the universally recognized values codified in the Helsinki Accord. And after 10 years, they saw their goals in a certain sense accomplished. Not only Soviet human rights violations became universally acknowledged and condemned, but Moscow itself, in the person of Mikhail Gorbachev, essentially pleaded guilty to them after having released Sakharov and other political prisoners. In a stark contrast today, hardly anyone in the West would deny the fact of massive human rights abuse in Russia. The central question, it seems to me, hanging over these discussions is rather, does it matter, given so many intractable problems and suffering in the world, and the seeming indifference of the post-Soviet Kremlin to any such critique? And isn't that even perhaps a distraction from other international causes that appear much more important to the more influential and numerous constituencies? Or maybe this regime is even a role model, not inspired but because of its nature, as some of the hard right in the West and the dark money behind them are looking to close the books on liberal democracy altogether. And yet I believe that we can and that we should build on the legacy of these hearings to preserve and to affirm the value and worth of the tradition of rational dialogue based on facts, the tradition that is now under such a ferocious assault in our developed world. And I agree with Tatiana Yankelevich's proposal last year to build upon these hearings, to steer public debate on the global crisis threatening our humanity through the lens of Sakharov's thought and action. And the continuing empowerment of anti-liberal and autocratic agendas in the West is one major manifestation of this crisis. Now, while we are not in a position, or at least not now, to launch anything on the scale of those hearings, we can collectively make our first step today. And then maybe someone else, hopefully in collaboration with us, might make a bigger step in this direction. And given that in October there will be the 50th anniversary of the first hearing, I'd like to propose to those present here to think about marking that date with more representative and thorough online conference exploring their significance and relevance for our days. Now, to conclude, I would like to go briefly back to the 19th century and to Alexander Herzen, who I believe can help us shed light on our current situation. In 1854, when Britain and France were about to enter the Crimean War, and some on the right wing in Western Europe were not happy about such a forceful response to Russia's expansion into the Balkans, Herzen published his open letter to William Linton, British liberal publisher and activist of the Chartist movement. Here is a quotation from this letter. "It would be madness to imagine that Emperor Nicholas, who started the Crimean War, could confront the whole of Europe unless Europe itself became the vanguard of Nicholas' army in order to fight against itself. But that is exactly what is happening. Not only bankers and journalists, but also prime ministers and royal kin are in the service of Tsar Nicholas. Should Europe clash with Russia, conservatism, fearful, anxious, decrepit, will find means to paralyze all popular support for self-defense." End of quote, translation mine. Contrary to Herzen's misgivings, Britain and France prevailed in that war, and Russia lost. To be sure, all three at the time were predatory colonial empires. Neither of them was a paragon of virtue. Yet from the standpoint of the interests of most Russians, that defeat turned out to be highly beneficial for them and for Russia's internal development, followed by the most far-reaching reforms in its history and rapid economic growth. Over a century later, the Soviet Union, a nuclear superpower like today's Russia, suffered defeat in Afghanistan, not without Western involvement. And that defeat had no less of a positive impact on its political development, much more so on the geopolitical situation of its neighbors, which for most of them became long-term and could not be reversed by subsequent changes inside Russia. These outcomes of the Crimean and of the Afghan war, each of them conceded after the death of that Russian ruler that launched it, became possible due to considerable Western unity around the rejection of Russia's repressive practices at home and attempts to expand them abroad. This unity is what both Sakharov and Herzen fought for, each in his own ways according to the conditions of his time, while exposing the promoters of Russia's imperial interests in Western capitals, quite often to the intense displeasure of their friends and allies in these circles. And while today's enablers seem to be so much more powerful, and the cause of Russia's anti-imperial dissenters so much more hopeless, to quote from the title of the latest book by Ben Nathans. Yeah, we've seen it before. So let's do what we got to do as particles of that international civil society to help inform the public debate and help restore democracy's unity of purpose vis-a-vis their opposite number. And now let me start introducing our remarkable speakers. We'll start with Mario Corti, who is a distinguished journalist, writer, analyst of Russian politics, society, and culture. He worked in the Italian embassy in Moscow in Soviet times, co-founded a publishing house in Milan, and publicized the work of Soviet human rights activists. He edited several books on Soviet dissent, chaired the organizing committee of the Second International Sakharov hearings in Rome, and organized exhibits of Samizdat document in Turin and Washington, D.C. He later joined Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Munich, and then became the director of its Russian service, working in this role from 1998 to 2003. He did a lot of work that you can find in his excellent bio on Free Media Online, a very interesting website that he's one of the editors. Mario is author and editor of several books, including in Russian. One of his books is called Salieri and Mozart. And let me finish with one quotation from Mario that I found particularly close to my heart. It is from his notes for the speech to the Sakharov hearing in Washington. Here is the quote. "I would like to express my hope that the concern for human rights in the so-called socialist bloc not lead to the easing of our own consciences, but would always be accompanied by an identical concern for the implementation of human rights in our own country, in our own home. If this were not so, then our work would be described in many convenient ways, but it could not be described as a true concern for human rights." End of quote. Now the floor is to Mario. Title is A Mouthpiece of Russian Propaganda and Disinformation.
As some of you may know, I began my career at Radio Liberty in January of 1979 as an editor and research analyst in the Samizdat unit. Selected Samizdat documents available in the West were meticulously retyped, annotated, cross-referenced, and whenever possible, name-indexed. These documents were then published both for internal and external use. Most of these writings, signed with the real names of their authors, primarily human rights activists, were broadcast in full and verbatim on the air. This unique approach, amplifying voices from within Soviet society, became Radio Liberty's hallmark. No other Western broadcaster devoted as much airtime, resources, or care to Samizdat materials. Launched through the ether, these writings of freedom fighters reached deep into Soviet territory, even remote regions. As a result, many listeners began to perceive Radio Liberty less as a foreign broadcaster and more as a domestic service. There isn't enough time here to recount the history of RFERL and its evolution after the collapse of communism and the Soviet Union and the emergence of new independent states. Suffice it to say that perhaps the most dangerous moment for the radio's survival came during that period, exactly when then President Jean-Pierre declared, "Our business is to get out of business." Many of us believed that RFERL's days were numbered and that only the RFERL Research Institute would survive. This institute, formed from a merger of research departments, archives, and the library, had been created in anticipation of the radio's shutting down. This was a miscalculation. Thanks to the advocacy of leaders like Lech Wałęsa of Poland and Václav Havel of the Czech Republic, who offered RFERL the former Czechoslovak National Assembly building in Prague to host RFERL's headquarters, broadcasting continued. Earlier, Estonia's then Foreign Minister Lennart Meri had even nominated RFERL for the Nobel Peace Prize. Meri, a faithful listener of the Russian service, after becoming Estonia's president, often called my former boss, Yuri Handler, to praise various programs. The radios eventually moved from Munich to Prague, where they had their ups and downs. After the departure of President Kevin Klose, new administrators unfamiliar with RFERL's unique nature arrived. They tried to impose standardized models disregarding linguistic and cultural differences. They increased bureaucracy and added unnecessary management layers while cutting on broadcasting staff. They even attempted to close the Russian service newsroom. A point was reached where the vice president assumed the title of editor-in-chief for all broadcasting, despite lacking familiarity with the languages, cultures, and histories of the target countries. A title that should legitimately belong only to each individual director of the respective broadcasting services, as was implicitly understood in the past. Yet, despite these vicissitudes, Radio Liberty's broadcaster upheld their mission with dignity and professionalism. They adapted to the changing society and audience, proving their relevance time and again. As my predecessor, Russian service director Yuri Handler, said, countering Jean Pell's view, RFERL was America's best insurance policy in case Russian democratic transition failed, which indeed occurred under Putin's restoration. That alone, for Handler, justified the continued existence of Radio Liberty. Today, we face a brutal, unprovoked war of aggression waged by Russia against Ukraine, a sovereign democracy. Independent media within Russia have been shut down and forced into exile. Journalists are being imprisoned, exiled, or killed. The Russian people desperately needs access to unbiased, reliable information, precisely at the moment when the new American administration is dismantling its international broadcasting. Much like its KGB predecessor, the FSB continues to infiltrate Western institutions and information spaces. However, as I once said in an interview, with certain individuals making decisions about US international broadcasting, the FSB could sleep soundly. Let me recall a quote from Andrei Sakharov's letter from the exile about that was mentioned by Dmitri before, published by the New York Times on June 8, 1980. Sakharov wrote, "The West and developing countries are filled with citizens who, by reason of their positions, are able to promote Soviet influence and expansionist goals." Today, that quote applies equally, if not more so, to Russian influence. While the US administration pulls funding from trusted global media, such as the Voice of America, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, and Radio and TV Marti, Russian propaganda and disinformation spread unchallenged, amplified by paid agents of influence, fellow travelers, and useful idiots, including so-called Russlandversteher, those who understand the reasons of Russia. I will not speculate here on whether the president of the USA or anyone in his team is a Kremlin asset. In any case, Sakharov's statement rings incredibly true regarding the current American leadership. The unfortunate reality is that this administration has become a mouthpiece for Russian propaganda and misinformation, evidenced by numerous statements from its members and the president himself. Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert Kennedy Jr. claims that Ukraine's 214 Revolution of Dignity was a coup d'etat financed by the USA. Trump's real estate buddy, Steve Witkoff, and his special envoy to Moscow argues that the occupied territories of Ukraine should belong to Russia because they are Russian-speaking. President Trump claims that Zelensky, a dictator without elections, started the war. In February, the US objected to calling Russia aggressor in a G7 statement marking the third anniversary of Russia's attack on Ukraine. At the same time, it declined to co-sponsor a UN resolution supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity and condemning Russian aggression. While Russia is on the brink of economic collapse, depends on weapons from China and Iran, and soldiers from prisons and North Korea, the apprentice dictator comes to its rescue. He comes to the rescue of Putin, someone he apparently admires. He flatters and appeases the Russian tyrant, an international outcast and a war criminal, elevating him to the status of a legitimate negotiation partner, siding with him and ready to hand him almost everything he wants, including territories that do not belong to Russia or America, but to a sovereign country. Asked by a journalist what Russia would have to give up as part of a peace agreement with Ukraine, Trump, in his characteristic convoluted manner, responded that Russia would have to give up all of Ukraine, meaning that Russia would be making a concession if it agrees not to take over the whole country. If we consider all of this alongside his statement that Ukraine will never join NATO, it becomes undeniable that Trump has no peace plan whatsoever. He is merely demanding Ukraine's capitulation to a country that has not won the war on the battlefield. The announcement that America might recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea de jure contradicts the principles of the inviolability of frontiers and territorial integrity enshrined in the UN Charter and rooted in the Helsinki Final Act. Implementing this would betray previous US commitments, ultimately leading to the destruction of the global architecture built and sustained for decades with the essential contribution of the USA. Recently, President Trump noted that Moscow is stronger than Kiev. The unfortunate truth is that Moscow has become stronger because it found a new ally in Washington. During the outrageous ambush on Zelensky in the Oval Office, Trump resorted to a card game metaphor. "You have no cards," he told him. Sure, after Trump's rise to power, Putin's got a trump in his hand. The longer this individual remains in power, the greater the damage he will inflict. If Russia's territorial grabs are legitimized, others will follow. America's long-standing as a beacon of liberty and a paragon of democracy is being destroyed by a man who is no peacemaker, but a warmonger. As former US ambassador to Kiev, Bridget Brink, said, "Peace at any price is not peace at all. It is appeasement. And appeasement does not lead to safety, security, or prosperity. It leads to new war and suffering." Building trust takes years, if not decades. Destroying it takes but a few days. And that's precisely what the current president has done. Returning to where I began, we don't yet know with absolute certainty whether RFE-RL will survive the year as an American institution. We know the Czech Republic is advocating for European support to keep it running. But God forbid that if RFE-RL becomes European, it shouldn't be renamed into RFA-RL, Radio Free America, Radio Liberty, with the addition of an American service staffed by American emigre journalists. The Trumps may come and go, but I hope that America, with its tradition of freedom and democracy, a country based on principles and virtues, now being trampled on by the current administration, will ultimately endure. Thank you for your attention.
And now I would like to give the floor to Alexandra Chalupa, a Ukrainian-American lawyer and human rights advocate who is currently pursuing her Ph.D. in international relations at the University of Sydney, where she previously earned a master's in international security. She is an expert on the Kremlin influence operations and political hybrid warfare, and has over 2 decades of American political experience, including as a Democratic National Committee senior advisor and elected member, which is how we met years ago. During Ukraine's 2013-14 Revolution of Dignity and subsequent Russian invasion, Ali facilitated connections between the Obama administration and the Ukrainian-American leaders and other stakeholders supporting democracy. And while working with the White House and the DNC on ethnic engagement, she was among the earliest to sound alarm about Russian interference in the 2016 elections. Then she became a target of the Russian cyber warfare. Alexandra highlights these experiences in her recently published chapter in the book, Routledge Handbook of the Influence Industry. The chapter is called The Kremlin's Influence Industry and Its Use of Lawfare to Undermine Democracy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dmitri. It's an honor to be here with everyone who's dedicated their lives to human rights and at this pivotal moment. And this includes carrying forward the teachings of Andrei Sakharov. I had my oldest daughter, Sophia, who's in high school, read his essay from Letter from Exile this week. And her reaction about halfway through was, Mom, Sakharov was warning, his warnings are exactly what's happening right now. And I just wish that so many more Americans understood this because it is such a stark reminder. I echo what the line that Mario put out, that the West must unite and pay special close attention, especially to the covert activities. One of the things he said is that since a person is inclined to forget something that is not waved in front of their eyes, and that's very important today, given that the West remains in what I believe is kind of a fog of war. Many see clearly Russia's conventional warfare, the genocidal assault in Ukraine that intensified just last night, with the worst attack in Kiev that was experienced since the full-scale invasion began. Drone attacks and ballistic missiles are impossible to ignore. But this is part of a larger war that we must recognize, one that's harder for many to see. And in that spirit of Sakharov's teachings, I want to focus on Russia's political hybrid warfare, operations designed to capture entire states from within, and that depend on a vast network of allies from targeted countries, including influential Americans who have become among Moscow's most willing and dangerous agents of influence. So during the next 10 minutes, I will focus on illustrating this from two interconnected stories that contribute to the crisis we collectively face today, some of which Mario has touched upon, but that provides additional background. They take shape in two different parts of a timeline that I'm going to focus on, 1987 and 2013. The first pertains to Sakharov's warnings about the Soviet peace movement, which helped seed the Kremlin's American influence network and grew into a dangerous alliance, one that includes the Russian Orthodox Church and the American Christian nationalists that gave rise to Christian nationalism today in the United States. The second will focus on how this entangled network secured political control over the US through ongoing Kremlin-sponsored political hybrid warfare for over the last 2 decades, of which I will incorporate some of my own experiences and perceptions during that time. In his letter from exile, Sakharov cautioned that even the people's deepest wish for peace is exploited, and this is perhaps the cruelest deception of all. In 1987, the Soviet Union was orchestrating a masterful influence campaign in the name of peace while committing atrocities in Afghanistan, causing millions of deaths and kidnapping countless children who were then taken to Moscow for Russian indoctrination, the way thousands of Ukrainian children are today. Atrocities that Sakharov was instrumental in warning against and was exiled for. The Soviet economy spinning in turmoil, Gorbachev introduced the perestroika and glasnost reforms while launching aggressive charm offense in the name of peace that drew Western elites to Moscow in unprecedented numbers. On Valentine's Day, the International Peace Forum for the Nuclear-Free World and for Survival of Mankind took place, attended by a rich tapestry of Western academics, scientists, officials, and experts. Sakharov had been released from exile a couple months earlier and participated in the event, and later acknowledged his double-edged predicament. On the one hand, understanding that the presence was in furtherance of Kremlin propaganda, but on the other, of vital opportunity. And as one of his colleagues summarized, his remarks at the event set the stage for elimination of thousands of nuclear ballistic missiles from the US and Soviet Union. But that year, the Soviet Committee for Peace launched many other initiatives, from peace rallies to peace walks and conferences and peace prayers with the Russian Orthodox Church leaders and an American evangelical powerhouse, Billy Graham. And it was that 4th of July that Trump first went to Eastern Europe with his wife, Ivana, and traveled to Moscow too. And given how many people traveled at that time was not the issue or unusual, it's what happened afterwards. That's when he started speaking for running for president. That's when he took out a full-page ad criticizing NATO. And since that point in time, he was very much consistently on Kremlin propaganda. By December of that year, the day Gorbachev and Reagan signed the historic treaty to eliminate the entire class of nuclear weapons, the chairman of the U.S. House Select Committee of Intelligence warned that 1987 was the most aggressive year of Soviet espionage and active measures targeting Americans to fuel divide, discredit the country in the eyes of our allies and the eyes of our own people, and that he was growing increasingly frustrated in his inability to communicate this to the public. He detailed a lot of the concerns that Sakharov himself had been saying, warning years earlier, and focused on an FBI report that echoed these warnings, including how the peace movement was being used for these influence operations. At the same time, the CIA circulated a report warning that the KGB-linked Russian Orthodox Church leaders were targeting American far-right and evangelicals in Kremlin-linked operations. Shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the evangelical base that was instrumental in Reagan's evil empire of rhetoric during the Cold War became entangled with the Russian Orthodox Church leaders, those connected with the KGB. One of Reagan's advisors and top donors from a powerful far-right Christian family at the time was Betsy DeVos, the sister of Eric Prince. Their parents were the ones who were the drivers of financing delegations of Christian far-right nationalists to Moscow to connect with the Russian Orthodox Church leaders and members of who ended up being a lot of Russian intelligence. At the same time, there was a academic, Alan C. Carson, from the Midwest, who was reached out to by two Russian academics linked to the Kremlin, who liked his white replacement theory paper that he wrote that blamed feminism, gays, and divorce on the declining white population. It would set the tone for what we're seeing a lot in these far-right culture wars going around the country, around the world today. In Moscow, Carlson traveled to meet with his Russian counterparts, and the host came up with the idea of the World Congress of Families, which is the foundation of today's global Kremlin-linked culture wars organization that targets women in the LGBT community. More than 2 decades later, this entangled network would help give rise to Trump's presidency as well. And this brings us to the 2013 component. In 2013, Obama's disastrous Russia reset that did not listen, that happened despite all the warnings coming from Russians, Ukrainians, and other Eastern Europeans, that it was vital not to normalize relations with the Kremlin after the invasion of Georgia and the atrocities that happened in Chechnya and the other signs of aggression. But the reset opened the floodgates for the Kremlin-linked oligarchs targeting Silicon Valley and gaining influence over Facebook and Twitter. Ukraine's president would warn 2 years later that these platforms were being weaponized by Russia to promote disinformation against Ukraine and other democracies, but no one listened. Obama's director of national intelligence, Michael Flynn, was cementing ties with the Russian military intelligence at the time, with GRU, even hosting closed-door training session for them and inviting their leadership to dinner at the U.S. ambassador's residence. Then the dominoes started falling faster. In May, Edward Snowden stole classified secrets and fled to Moscow. In June, Trump announced he was moving his Miss Universe pageant to Moscow, right after the Russian Duma passed draconian laws targeting women and the LGBTQ community, laws written with the help of the American evangelicals who supported Trump later on, members of the World Congress of Families. Meanwhile, Paul Manafort, Trump's longtime associate and future campaign chairman, was working with American operatives and GRU agents to prop up Ukraine Kremlin-backed dictator he helped install. When that regime fell to the Maidan protests, Russia invaded. It's important to note that when Russia may not have successfully captured Kiev with conventional warfare, it had done so in the past through political warfare with the help of this American network that included both Republican and Democratic operatives. During the Maidan protests, I volunteered at the time to help the White House and working with National Security Council and Vice President's office, organize a series of meetings with stakeholders with events that were happening. And it was around that time that I had learned that Manafort was behind a lot of the activities and still advising Yanukovych throughout this period and the protests, and often traveling back and forth from Kiev to Russia. But the warnings about his activities fell on deaf ears, including the ones that I did leading up to the 2016 election and throughout. By December 2015, the Kremlin wasn't even hiding its American influence operations anymore. They were flaunting what I like to call the guns, God, and patriotism strategy to capture America. Putin was hosting Billy Graham's son, Franklin Graham, who met with Putin and top Russian Orthodox leaders, and was instrumental in Trump's support. The NRA leadership was posing with Kremlin agents in Moscow, and Michael Flynn and the Green Party candidate Jill Stein sitting in Putin's own table at an RT gala. The same month, RT's founder was found dead in a Washington hotel. It took 4 years for the Republican Senate Intelligence Report to confirm exactly what I had been warning about, that Manafort was a national security threat who coordinated with Russian intelligence before, during, and after the 2016 election, continuously feeding them confidential campaign information. And while these Russian investigations were highly obstructed, that was still a critical finding, a finding that was published during the Democratic Convention in 2020 to bury it so that it made barely any news. And I was mentioning the reports because they confirmed that Manafort and a GRU agent colleague of his were personally targeting me in an operation to blame me and Ukraine for the 2016 election. Throughout Trump's first presidency, those of us who warned about Putin's attack faced systematic retaliation. It was a sophisticated Kremlin influence operation. Ukrainian anti-corruption officials, FBI agents, and investigating Manafort and I were targeted in. A few days after Trump and Putin had their first meeting, in-person meeting in 2017, the White House launched a two-week aggressive disinformation influence operation blaming me in Ukraine for the election interference. The more the Russian investigations heated up on them, the more they became aggressive toward those of us who warned. The Kremlin disinformation then evolved into lawfare with Manafort's network. Oliver Stone made a documentary promoting their lies, featuring Putin and Ukraine's former corrupt president. The financier of it was Medvedchuk, the Ukraine oligarch that Putin planned to install as president after his 3-day military operation, but didn't go anywhere because it failed. These influence operations are basically, should be understood as that they are one of the main reasons we cannot trust this network to be engaged in peace, and how peace is being weaponized under Ukraine. And also that now with the state capture, the United States is being weaponized against our allies, and their network that Manafort leads is fully operational and is trying to prop up pro-Kremlin candidates in Europe, Australia, Canada, and elsewhere. And there needs to be an international coalition of containment against this.
Ali's title of her presentation was "The Fog of War: The Kremlin Influence Industry Use of Political Warfare for State Capture." Our next speaker is Irina Busygina, and you're joining right here from New York, right?
I'm joining from Columbia University, where I'm at the ISN conference right now.
Yes, where I used to teach years ago. Irina is a research scholar at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard. She worked as professor of comparative politics in the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and left the country after the outbreak of the war in 2022. Her research and teaching interests include comparative federalism and decentralization. She also works on Russian domestic and foreign policies and Russia-EU relations. Her most recent books are Non-Democratic Federalism and Decentralization in Post-Soviet States, published in London by Routledge, co-authored with Mikhail Filippov, and another book by the same publishing house, How Geography and Institutions Shape the Development of Nations. Irina's title of her remarks is Putinversteher: The Kremlin's Narratives Among German Elites at the Time of the War Against Ukraine.
I would like to start with saying that thank you very much for this kind invitation and the possibility to talk here. And Tatiana, Daragaya, thank you to you especially. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible, and I wouldn't meet you all here. So now our scene is Germany, and we are going to discuss my focus is Germany, and the question which I posited myself before when I started to prepare for the notes. I was living in Germany for many years, so I know the country quite well, I suppose. But the question was why Germany, the strongest country in the European Union, the largest country, why is such an easy victim of the Russian narratives, of the war narratives, of the Russian idea? So what makes this strong country so weak? And then I was thinking about the notion of the Putinversteher, which is not by chance. The term was born in Germany, and the Putinversteher. Probably, I'm absolutely sure that you know this term. This is about Putin, and then this is Versteher. So this is those he or him who understands Putin. Right. So this is so I was thinking that Putinversteher, it was not the very new concept, and so my starting point that was thinking that no, not that long ago in time, but not in political time, but in time, there were that many Putinverstehers in the German public, also in the German political elites, when Russia was considering German Republic as its main ally within the European Union, and the cultural relationship was flourishing, and the economic interdependence was on the rise. Each year we demonstrated even more interdependence and also dependence from Germany on the Russian oil and gas, and Moscow was calling Germany the hegemon in the European Union, which is absolutely not a case. The European Union has no hegemons, but they thought it would be nice for Germans to hear. And the former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder was the main German Russian lobbyist in Berlin and in Germany. So this was then the Putinversteherism, if you want, was spread all over Germany. And interestingly, this approach was not changed in Germany with the Russian 5 years war against Georgia in the year 2008, and even after the annexation of Crimea. Even more interestingly, even after the annexation of Crimea, this was the German idea was mainly. I was talking to a lot of German politicians and political experts. They were saying, "Oh no, things are not that bad. Things are not that bad. This is still Putin is not that bad, and the economic relations are so important for Germany, should be persisted, and Russia is not a real threat." So this is the concept. So for me, what really changed with the full-fledged war, which Russia started in February of 2022, this is the perception of threat. Now Russia is perceived as a threat to, at least in official discourse, to German and to the European security. Okay, but still, this is not the consensus about this. We still have the political parties. Okay, this is like you know, the Alternative for Germany and the German left, so Die Linke, and the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, so the Union of Sarah Wagenknecht, which are not in the Bundestag, but still. But this is the right, left and right radical parties. But what strikes me as the most, that the Putinversteher are sitting in the traditional German parties, and also in the SPD. So this is in the Social Democratic Party, and in the CDU, CSU. So this is again. So this is the party where now Germans have the Chancellor. This is the Friedrich Merz. What I wanted to say, I wanted to bring you a collection of arguments why Germany is special. I understand every country is special, but why particular Germany is so special in terms of being so non-resistant to Russian narratives. And then I will try to summarize what kind of narratives are kind of Kremlin things the Germans would like, and that will be it. So talking about the why, what facilitates this penetration of Kremlin's narratives to Germany. These are several. Maybe I'm wrong, you can criticize me, but what I do think that first, this is the feeling of guilt. There's still guilt after the Second World War, and this was the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union is hard to criticize because of this guilt phenomenon, guilt complex, if you want. Then another thing, this is that the country is what also facilitates this penetration. So this is what we are talking about. This is the split between East and West Germany. You know it better than me, but if you would see the regional variation is enormous, enormous. So there are many Putin sympathizers in political and also in the general public in the East than in the West. Okay, then this is the trauma I think of the migrant flows which radicalized the German political landscape very much. This is the immigrants from Syria. This is immigrants from African countries. So this is what was called multiculturalism in the good old times of the Chancellor Merkel. But another thing, and this is what makes it also, you know, my thesis is that Russia easily penetrates where the political system of a country is already shaken. I hope I'm clear enough in saying this. And this was exactly Germany. The political situation in Germany, the political system in Germany started to change. So this was the right moment for Russia to penetrate when the Germany was particularly weak. And what do I mean by this? I mean this radicalization. I mean the new parties. And I think also that the new parties and the transformation of the party landscape. And Germany is a party democracy. For Germany, parties are everything, but absolutely everything is a party state. If you would read the books on comparative politics, they would tell you immediately Germany is a party state. So party system is absolutely alpha and omega of German politics. And if it is changing, starting with the Greens, but then with the AfD and Linke and what you want. This is tremendous shock for a country, tremendous shock. So this was this moment that Russia skillfully, but okay, not skillfully used. And my other argument is that my last argument why, and here you can say me how you dare to say this, but I would believe that a lot of this penetration of the Russian narratives to the German public to be then articulated in the German political narratives is the existence of the very large Russian-speaking community. In the large cities, Berlin would be the best example. These people who speak Russian, with whom I was talking a lot because I'm very often in Germany, these people who are electing Putin, who are voting, who are standing in queues to vote for Putin, they have two citizenship, Russian and German, and there are a lot of them. This is the critical mass. These people living in a democratic society are not Democrats and not liberals. And these people are not integrated, they are not accepted and not I will go as far as to say they are bad citizens. They're just bad citizens for a European country, for Germany. And this was, I don't want to say who is guilty, who is to blame about this, but these people make the climate. They make the political climate a lot. And these people have direct links, and they are direct kind of networks with the Russian secret services, with the Russian state oligarchs, with the Russian NGOs, you know, who support the war and so on and so forth. My last point, just very briefly, is what do they actually sell? What does Kremlin sell? What is so attractive for the public and for the political circles of Germany? Very simple things. First, the war is too expensive. Why should our taxpayers pay for the war? Look at the very recent report here I was writing. This is the Institute for Market Integration and Economic Policy. Look, the name, right? So this is the new report. How we should combine the peace in Ukraine with the normalization of mutually beneficial economic relations with Russia, as if this is the only talk about economic relations, which is absolutely a bloody lie, because this is not about economic relations, this is about relations. So why should our taxpayers, we think about our taxpayers. So we don't think about Putin, no, we think about taxpayers. And common economic space from Lisbon to Vladivostok, does it reminds you about something. Yeah, I'm full of remembrance about общий европейский дом, да, from Lisbon до Vladivostoka. Okay, so this is what I call economic argument. Economic argument, which is for Germans, you know, they count money. They do count money. They like to do it. So this is also a culture, and I see nothing better. But this is, it works. Then the second thing is to undermine the European idea, that the European Union is nothing, that it has no value, it has no cost. It only prevents Germany to have a strong leadership, right? So this is, and you would not believe how in the recent years the decrease of the popularity of the European Union and European idea, it's striking, it's awful. Really, it's very much about Russian propaganda in Germany, about sovereignty, about European values as non-existent values. Then Germany is now chaos and instability, and Russia is order and stability. This fantastic argument Russia is selling everywhere, not only to Germany but also to the post-Soviet Union space, to Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine before the war. This is a normal Russian. Russia is stability. Russia exports stability. This kind of stability without freedom, stability without liberty, but you know, stability and state everywhere. So look how Russia is doing. And the last argument that Russia would sell to Germany. This is a very populistic. Everything is populistic there, but this is particularly populistic argument. This is about that. These politicians who don't want the normalization of Russia, they don't listen to their electorate, right? So if you don't listen to the people, so what should you do? You should listen to your people, and this is what the people are saying. And you are either blind, or you are a traitor. So if you are blind, this is bad because you're a bad politician. But if you're a traitor, this is also bad because you have to be, I don't know, removed absolutely. And my last point is that, very last point is that all these arguments, they work in a combination. Russia normally works with a combination. So it's not one by one, but this is together. Trying to formulate a framework. And why this framework works, not because it's sophisticated, not because it's smart, not because it's clever, not at all. But this is because this particular kind of German context and Russian presidential administration, they know what to press and how to work with the German society and politics.
It was very substantial and lots of questions that I would wish to ask about Putinversteher being not the same as Russlandversteher. Where are the Sakharov'S in Germany? Do they exist? But I don't want to take time. I will leave the questions for the end. I would like to give the floor to our next speaker, who actually also has Putinversteher in his writings. Only we are now moving back to Italy, and I will introduce Massimiliano Di Pasquale. Massimiliano is a research associate at the Gino Germani Institute of Social Sciences and Strategic Studies in Rome, where he runs the Ukraine Observatory. After graduating in business administration from Bocconi University in Milan, he specialized in the culture, politics, and society of post-Soviet states. He is an expert in Ukrainian culture and politics, member of the Baltic Studies section of the University of Milan. He has worked on disinformation, active measures, publishing articles on these topics in specialized journals. He writes about Ukraine, the post-Soviet space in Italian journals, and is the author of the books, including, in translation, the title is Ukrainian Borderland, Travels in Unknown Europe, and Ukrainian Primer, actually two, Ukrainian Primer and Ukrainian Primer 2.
Thanks for the invitation, Dmitri, and thanks to all the other speakers. I would like to start with connecting my speech to the one just made by Irina. Irina said that Germany is special. I would like to say that Italy is special as well. When I say that Italy is special, I want to stress the fact that the Italian environment is very particular, and Moscow has been very active in recently, but even in the past. So if we want to understand the situation in Italy, which is a situation where the Russian disinformation as well as the Russian strategic narratives are widespread, not just in pro-Kremlin or websites linked to the Kremlin, but also in the mainstream media. If you want to understand why we can find Russian propaganda even on the mainstream media, if you want to understand why, for example, Solovyov or even Lavrov have been invited to TV program or national TV programs, we need to go back to the days of the Cold War. I think it's important to give an historical background, because without this historical background, we can't understand the situation now in Italy and why Italy is really in danger. We can say that since the days of the Cold War, Italy has been a major target of Moscow disinformation, propaganda, and other active measures. Italy today is a pillar of a country of NATO and the EU, and plays a particular role in the Mediterranean area. It is a key ally of the US, and it has an important military role. At the same time, Italy is perceived by Moscow as a sort of a weak link in the NATO and in the EU, because Moscow sees several vulnerabilities that can be exploited to expand his influence, which are the main vulnerabilities that we can see in the Italian ecosystem and political system. It is there is a sort of mistrust or hostility towards NATO, towards EU, and towards US, which characterizes a large sector of the society. There is a naivete regarding Russian domestic and foreign policy. This is widespread among political administrators and intellectual elites. Also, there is a lack of knowledge and analytical expertise about Russia and the post-Soviet region in the Italian academia and the think tanks. And of course, there is a presence of influential pro-Kremlin political and economic lobbies. And another thing that is important to stress is that we have a sort of deficit when we want to talk about national security. So there is no or a big lack of national security culture. And this characterizes, with a few exceptions, the Italian political world. For at least 10 or 15 years, the pro-Kremlin disinformation and propaganda ecosystem has been spreading multiple strategic narratives in the Italian information space. And the aim of these narratives was to confuse public opinion about the goal and the instruments of Russian foreign policy. This was in order to undermine Italy's Atlanticist and European orientation. In this dynamic, of course, the role played by the so-called alternative media and influencer or so-called experts, even in the mainstream information space, actually was very important. Even after the Russian full invasion of 2022, which drew strong condemnation and Putin regimes in Italy, the pro-Kremlin narratives are still very present, and still mainstream experts and commentators continue to go on TV or to write articles in magazines and in national newspapers, pro-Russian, of course, articles, which influence very much the public debate and the cultural debate. We need to have a look at the historical factors, why Italy is so susceptible to Russian strategic narratives. First of all, we have to say that historically, Italian intellectuals and politicians have been very sympathetic to Russia. Despite belonging to opposing military blocs during the Cold War, the USSR and Italy continued to maintain good economic and political relations. Due to the enormous cultural influence of the Italian Communist Party on the Italian society during the Cold War, anti-American sentiment, anti-Western feelings permeated the political debate. Although Italian foreign policy remained Atlanticist and pro-American. For example, according to a study made by Elena Agarossi and Victor Zaslavsky, the Italian Communist Party succeeded in spreading the belief in the imminent collapse of capitalism and linking this collapse to the belief of the myth of the Soviet proletarian state by appealing to the anti-capitalist, anti-American sentiments which were prevalent in the Italian fascist, Catholic, socialist, and communist circles. So there was a widespread movement of opinion. As the time passed, the idealization of the USSR diminished, but and even if the Communist Party distanced itself from the Soviet regime, but still the denigration of the Western culture remained an important feature of the political discourse in Italy. And so this anti-Americanism and these anti-Western feelings continue to define communist identity and permeate a large sector of the Italian culture until the collapse of the USSR. What happened after the collapse of the USSR? Well, in the early 90s, we see in Italy the phenomenon of Russo-Bronismo, which is called Red Brownism, which was an ideological synthesis of fascism and communism. And this phenomenon began to develop in the 90s, initially only within the Italian far right. Then it became widespread even in the populist movement. So this phenomenon is characterized by extreme nationalism and sovereigntism, the fight against globalization, the fight against capitalism, the fight against Americanism, the fight against and the fight against the European Union, and the call for a return to traditionalism and against the decadence of the liberal democratic society. It's important to stress that in the 90s and even later, this phenomenon and this movement began an intense collaboration with the ultra-nationalist Russian intellectuals and politicians like Alexander Dugin. Dugin traveled a lot in Italy during the 90s. And what happened later? Later, with the rise of Vladimir Putin in 1999, and especially after the Kremlin shift in the second half of the 20s of the 2000s towards a more assertive nationalist foreign policy, the red-brown universe grew and acquired an increasingly pronounced pro-Russian and Putinist profile. Red-brownism became a political relevant phenomenon in 2012-2013, and their ideas would enter mainstream political and media debates, thanks to the populist and sovereignist wave that was transforming the Italian political system at the time. But the Moscow active measures in Italy in the Putin era were aimed at strengthening both the red-brownism and also the Russland-Versteher, because there was also a very strong Russland-Versteher movement, and which was quite different from the red-brownism. But why? Because unlike the Red Browns, the Russland-Versteher did not attack the West, NATO and the EU, but they stressed that in order to protect the strategic interest of Italy, especially in the economic and in the energy fields, Italy must, while belonging to NATO and belonging to EU, cultivate a particular relationship with Russia and strengthen cooperation with Moscow So the Russian, the Russlandversteher, like the Red Browns, admire Putin and consider Putin a political leader and a statesman. And when the Ukrainian crisis of the 2013 and 14, so the starting of the Maidan erupted, the Russlandversteher orientation had already occupied a dominant position in academia and the foreign policy community in Italy. Okay, after this historical background, which is key to understand the political and the cultural environment of Italy, I would like to just to spend some words about a study that we have done as Gino Germani Institute recently, which is sort of a new study, which is quite new and is very peculiar, because we have analyzed the strategic messages that we have found, not just in the newspaper as we did as we have done before, or in the academia, but we have been asked in a way to have a look at some geography textbooks which have been adopted, which are adopted in the Italian lower secondary school. And what we found, which is very scaring in a way, we have found similar narratives to the narratives that have been used by the Putin regime to justify his war against Ukraine. So the need for this work arose following several reports by families of the students, institutions, such as the Ukrainian embassy in Italy. And these reports regarding the alleged distortion of the past and the recent history of the Ukraine and other countries of former USSR. So we have studied a sample of 28 books selected, both following the reports received and the others following a random method. And the text we have analyzed in the paper were published in the last 15 years. So the oldest one is a text published in 2010, and the newest one is a text published in 2024. So after the full-scale invasion. What we have found basically seven narratives that mirrors the narrative of Putin's war in Ukraine. For example, in Donbass, there is a Russian ethnic majority, according to these books, and a civil war between Ukrainians and Russians broke out in 2014. Then another narrative is about Crimea. Crimea returned to Russia after a referendum. None of these books mention the fact that why the so-called referendum was not accepted by the international community. There is no mention of this. And also, even the graphic of the book includes the map includes Crimea in the Russian Federation. Also, Kievan Rus is the progenitor of the Russian kingdom and the Russian nation. And another narrative we have found is that Ukrainian is a failed state. Also, with this narrative about the failed state, which is a very common narrative, we have found in two books the fact that, according to these books, the main industrial sector in Ukraine are the military and the weapons sectors, which is of course not true. But you can imagine, you associate the idea of a Ukrainian as a non-existent state, as a failed state, which is full of weapons. And I mean, this is very, very scaring. And these books were written before the war. And there is also the narrative about the NATO encirclement. So the Kremlin's current policy is due to NATO encirclement of Russia. And a very popular one, which we found in almost every textbook of the 28 we have examined, is that there is a Russian region. There is a Russian region sharing the same culture and the same language and the same alphabet, which includes Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and the Baltic state. Along with this narrative, which is the narrative of the Ruski Mir, if you want. There is another interesting narrative, which is the fact that Eastern European culture equals, coincides with Russian culture. So in some of these books, we have found a text where there are highlighted some important so-called Russian figures in the fields of literature, in the fields of engineering, in the fields of scientific fields. And the funny thing is that there is no mention, for example, of Czesław Miłosz, which was a Nobel Prize for literature amongst the so-called Eastern European culture. There is no mention of Taras Shevchenko, for example, no mention of Milan Kundera, but we have mentions of minor literature figure in the Russian culture. And there is also a very funny thing that Kazimir Malevich, which was a 19th century painter, was and he lived in Kiev, and his parents were from Poland, so he was a Polish living in Kiev, and of course, in this book he was labeled as Russian.
That's remarkable in historical terms, given that in Italy, during Sakharov time, the so-called Euro-communist movement, the Italian Communist Party, personified by people like Enrico Berlinguer, were among the most vocal critics of both repression in Soviet Union and the war and the invasion of Afghanistan. And where are they now? That's a rhetorical question. Basically, all my own questions, which could be many, but they could be summed up with one. It's about liberal Russian tradition in exile in those countries and how it comes that really Russia is personified by Putin and by those Russian voters who are supporting him, given so many efforts devoted by Russian liberal intellectuals in Russia and in exile to conveying the other vision of Russia. But let's not start with my questions. I would rather ask us to look into the questions that have been posed here in the chat. And I think many of you can go through them.
I'm happy to read the questions, if you will, but I think everyone can read them.
Right. Right. There are questions about the United States that I think Ali, to some extent, would be the best to answer. At the beginning from Daniel Zilberman, who is our coordinator in San Francisco, by the way.
If I may suggest, perhaps we should go first with the questions that could be answered by Irina, if any.
Right.
And I would read them. How to avoid mistrust between exiles and other immigrants from Russia, provided that Kremlin sponsorship to penetrate in foreign state governments and at least into immigration communities, provided that Kremlin sponsors. I would edit this question slightly. And also, I think the question that she can answer, counter question, can pro-Kremlin Russians be screened without the kind of expertise and cultural competency that only anti-authoritarian exiles can provide? And where are the voices and the influence of those people and Russian liberals in general, such as Sergei Lagodinsky, a member of the German Bundestag. I think these questions should be directed at Irina if she's willing to respond to them. That would be nice before she leaves us.
Thank you very much. Fantastic questions. My 2 minutes. About mistrust, first question about the liberal part of the immigration in Germany. Second question, the answer to the first question is very simple. There are no ways. There are no ways. This mistrust is only growing, and this is, at least I don't see any, neither theoretical nor practical possibilities probably we should reformulate the question. What to do instead of mistrust? Probably we would need something else, to do something else out of mistrust. I don't know. I need to think about this. But if you put this as straight as possible, if you want to prevent mistrust, it's not possible. The other question is about liberal organizations and NGOs and everything. If you want, in Germany, this is many things regarding to Russia. This is all in Germany. If you want to find something relating to Russia, you found it in Germany. This is absolutely there. So, but why I was asking myself also, why do these people, these organizations, don't play a role, a political role or a social role they deserve? And I would say these are for many things, because they're too slow, because they still live in the previous times, because they cannot formulate their agenda. They are not coordinated at all. So this is which happens all the time about Russian opposition. This is no coordination. Coordination is the word. I don't know what is wrong with Russians, but somehow they fear and hate coordination. They're not. I was talking while I'm in Berlin often, so I was talking to different organizations. They cannot find a united approach to any of the challenges, to any of the issues. Whose is this war? Is this war of Putin, or is this war of Putin and Russian citizens? Absolutely. So this is a split issue. What is about sanctions? Split issue. Weapons delivery to Ukraine? Split issue. Ukraine in the European Union and in NATO? Split issue. What are you expecting if you are not coordinating at all, and you're investing zero resources into coordination, and you even don't articulate this problem of coordination? My very last point, that what exacerbates the situation is that these actors in Berlin by German politicians, they are not accepted as they represent Russia. They do not represent current Russia. This is the very stereotypic argument. You are in Germany. You don't know Russia. You don't know Russia anymore. We better listen to these Russians who are in Russia, if we can do that. I don't know in what kind of their how we do it, but still, these people, they're already representing more Germany. So Russia in Germany and not Russia in Russia. So, and it makes it also difficult to find a niche and a profile and the audience to whom you want to influence. They cannot identify their audience. If you want, the first thing you want to identify whom and saying what. They don't do this. So I'm sorry to be pessimistic, but this is what my impressions. Fresh impressions.
So look in the United States.
One, I think that would be very important to hear from Ali would be, why did Robert Mueller, special investigation into Trump's Russia collusion, has never reached a conclusion about proof of Trump's collusion with Putin's regime? From David Zilberman.
Yes, thank you for the question.
Daniel, forgive me.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Tatiana. And thank you, Daniel, for the question. Mueller had a lot of obstruction throughout the investigation, and he had his hands tied where he couldn't investigate the money. He wasn't allowed to do that. Despite that, he found a tremendous amount of red flags and said that that Trump could not be dismissed of what happened, and that more investigation was needed. And half the report focused on Paul Manafort specifically. And it went to Congress then to step it up with the hearings and to do more down the road. But the political will was not there, because one of the things that happened for the obstruction is that Trump replaced his previous attorney general with Bill Barr, who was a very political appointment. And he issued a 4-page letter that basically summarized the report in a way that dismissed it and was not representative of it. And then by the time the full one was released, the political will just wasn't there, and people were moving on to the next election. But the important one is the one that I referenced. It's the Senate Intelligence Report, Volume 5, that came out in 2020, a year or so after. And that one is very incriminating and shows the Russian intelligence ones. And while we are on this, I'm going to send it to you right now in the chat. It was available on the Senate Intelligence website. All 5 volumes of the report of those investigations were available a few days ago. They have since been scrubbed from the US Senate Intelligence. So none of them are available right now, but I found another website that has them.
There was a question about how to counter this propaganda.
Yes.
And active measures. I can speak for Italy, but I think some of my consideration can be applied to other European countries. We need to educate younger generations to the culture of a democratic and open society. This seems a very simple statement, but it is not. Because I'll give you an example. In Italy, in the history books, we read statements about Nazis, but we don't read that much about totalitarianism. What was the totalitarianism? There is no deep knowledge of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, for example. We need to do a lot on this side. Increase the awareness of totalitarianism is very important. How to do that? For example, to study history in a proper way, not the Soviet version of the history, which is taught in the Italian in many Italian educational institution, and read authors like George Orwell, Hannah Arendt, Robert Conquest.
There is a question from Daniel Silberman that would be very good to hear from in response to it from Mario Corti. The question is actually both Ali and Mario. I would like to hear what they have to say about the first part of the question. Is it true that Trump appoints Kari Lake, his propagandist from Arizona, in charge of Voice of America, that he pretty much destroyed? And the second question that I think Mario could respond to: what is the fate of Radio Svoboda, and how we, the listeners, can support the free speech?
Yes, and if I may say something that I probably have mentioned, and also I think Mario is an expert on that. It strikes me as a paradox, speaking of Italy, that the Kremlin influence there appears to be so much stronger today than it was in late Soviet times, when the Communist Party, seemingly the close ideological ally of the Soviet Union, was a very harsh critic of the violations of human rights and of the invasion of Afghanistan, whereas today, I don't know, I'm not an expert on Italy, but there are no voices anywhere close to that kind of.
If I may add to the list, Italian Communist Party and Mario and Massimiliano, correct me if I'm wrong, also spoke very energetically against the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968.
The liberty has a very complex history, and there are many points of view. It's like the elephant of the Indian tail. Everyone sees what he wants to see. You know the Indian tale about the blind people. You know, they're touching that elephant, and someone says this is a serpent because he's touched
tail.
Yeah, and another says it's a column because he's touched one leg. So there are many points of view and many narratives and many stories about RFE-ARA. The fate of RFE-ARA is so far unknown. You probably very well know that the court in Washington, Columbia District, has decided that the U.S. Agency for Global Media should send the money that had already been allocated by Congress at least for the month of April. And for a long time, they didn't send any money. Eventually, last week they did. The court has not made yet a final decision, which will be probably in favor of RCC-ARA. But as you all know very well, this administration doesn't care at all about court decisions. I mean, there's the system of checks and balances is not working anymore.
Yes.
Tribes decides, if he decides about something, he tries to implement this, disregarding Congress decisions and disregarding courts decision, as he has already shown. So it is what will happen eventually, we don't know. I am a little skeptical about the European community or any European country taking over RL and funding it. No one knows what RCC-ARA is. No government can make this decision without consulting those who have elected. It's a consulting parliament, for example. And in parliament, this is something that hardly would go through. We have known this from many Congress disputes as to funding RCC-ARA in the past, you know, and there have always been difficulties. And every year, the budget is being discussed. Every year, there are lots of problems as to how much money should we continue funding it or not. So this is the situation about RCC-ARA. What's going to happen? I have no idea. All I know and what I think about it, I already said in my speech at the beginning.
Let's give the floor to Andrew Grigorenko, who is our co-founder as well, and the president of General Petro Grigorenko Foundation and participant of many human rights undertakings since the 60s in Soviet Union.
Concerning Sakharov international hearings, that has usually, except of history, it also has a prehistory. It was several ideas to have some kind of tribunal which would condemn communist regime as strongly as was Nazi regime was condemned after the Second World War. That never materialized really, but idea was flying anywhere in the air, particularly probably in Soviet Union when some liberty appears. Of course, representative of Soviet society, which was critical to the regime, was a tiny one. Quoting Yulia Kim, it was in his, he wrote the song right after the trial of Dobrovolsky, Lashkova, and Ginsburg. And he had a word that that very narrow circle of the oppositioners, it was so easy they were circled in the yard. That was true, but still the voice surprisingly was heard. And it's probably, it would not be heard unless certain events were changing Western understanding what is going on behind that Iron Curtain. Misunderstanding still exists. But when I was happened thrown away from the Soviet Union and appeared in the West, first in Germany, I just couldn't believe myself how that misunderstanding or not understanding what is really going on was behind the scene. But that started changing. I just would like to even bring an example. My wife and I were attending German courses in Germany. And at a certain point, when we already start understanding, can say something in German, our teacher started asking about nationality of her student. And when it came to me, I said, I'm Ukrainian. She said, there is no such nation as Ukraine. I said, what do you mean? It's one of the founding United Nations organization. And it was funny because the two Canadians were also students. They said, wait a second, Ukrainian make it third minority in Canada. So that's how you can say it. They didn't mention that also Ukrainian Canadian was a governor of Canada for some time also. A few events in the West which probably helped to disperse some kind of fog about the certain things. And one of them that probably was awarding Sakharov Nobel Prize. And also the Archipelago Gulag was published by Solzhenitsyn. It also played the certain role. And all of a sudden it came appeal that was called Moscow appeal. That appeal somehow worked for some circle in the West. It was strange collection of the people, rightists and leftists. That group, unknown practically to anybody in the West, appealed to the Danish parliament, asking them to give parliament building in Copenhagen as a stage for that hearing. They planned to call it tribunal, but then they decided to go for a milder version, so it was called hearing. But nevertheless, for the hearing, they decided that it should be some kind of jury. It was a lot of machination and a lot of political game behind the scene. But nevertheless, that Danish parliament decided to give that stage for the hearing. Actually, it was altogether was conducted 5 hearings, one in Copenhagen in 75, then in Rome in 77, then in Washington, D.C. in 79, then in Lisbon in 83, and last in London in 85. It was planned for the 6th one, which was supposed to take place in Bonn, but it never materialized. Who was actually organizing and making the hearing, collected the list of witnesses. Some people are objecting to certain witnesses. It was inside of the Soviet diaspora as well, some kind of dispute, who is who is what. And some representative of Russian, at least diaspora, decided not to participate in the hearing. I was one of the people who was invited as a witness. I could have speak about a lot of other things, but the general decision was, or mutual decision was that I would speak about Crimean Tatar problem because I was very familiar. I was actually involved in the Crimean Tatar patriotic movement for a long time already, many years. And I was very close, and especially my closest friend, Mustafa Dzhemilov, I was a leader of that movement. And other people as well. I also have to say that it was some controversy on the hearing itself. For example, I was attacked by a right Ukrainian diaspora because I was speaking Russian on the hearing, not Ukrainian. But believe or not, but there was no Ukrainian translator, so I could have spoken Ukrainian, but who would translate it? Unfortunately, the hearings do not have archive at all. And for the first hearing, the one very detailed, and I think that the most complete following for the hearing was published in the United States in English. And it was published by Ukrainian diaspora publishing house called Smola Skip, which is means torch. They published practically not only these witnesses, they also some other material which was presented at the hearing, which I'm very thankful. By the way, that's publishing house now in Ukraine, in Kyiv. Especially, I was very thankful for Mr. Yankelevich, who was a major motor behind the publishing house. It also was very nice that some prominent figures were present at the hearing, including Ionescu, Wiesenthal, and many other people who presented that's, I would say, liberal part of the Western countries. I guess I will finish on the history of it, but I just need to say something on the future. To continue or to revive Sakharov hearings would be impossible, probably, because first of all, I'm not sure that even funding would be possible for that kind of continuation. And besides that, Sakharov hearings, the first 5 ones, were mostly concentrated on the Soviet bloc. And now the world is more complicated. If Russia trying to revive some communist past, I doubt that it is possible to revive the communist past. But what they're doing more successfully, reviving the Russian imperial past. And war against Ukraine, that's one of the most illustrative act of that new Russian imperialism. For me being American of Ukrainian descent, of course, I'm probably biased because my countrymen now are killed for just being Ukrainian. And my native village occupied now by Russian troops, and actually even the area, my native area, Zaporizhia, announced by Kremlin as Russian. No, we are not Russian and never will be. Zaporizhia is a cradle of Ukrainian democracy and Ukrainian independence. And so it never was Russian and never will be. I forgot to mention that, but it's important to mention. There is a Sakharov International Conferences. It was 15 of them took place already. The last one was in Vilnius.
The topic about hearings in memory of the hearings. That's something that at least I personally would like to keep in mind and to work on. And I would like to give the floor to a co-founder and co-chair of a board of directors and the former director of the Sakharov program at Harvard, among many other credentials, Tatiana Yankelevich.
Thank you very much, Dmitri. And thank you everyone who was able to be present today. And unfortunately, it's not a very good timing given the Memorial Day weekend, but in a way, it is a memorial, reminds us that we pay tribute to the memory of Andrei Sakharov and all those who stood with him and supported him in the world, in Russia, in Ukraine, and in many other countries. And I ask forgiveness of all of you, because I'm bound to repeat some of the things that were already said by probably Mario and Andrei and even some others, but I do wish to give you not my version, but a little bit more detailed account of the Sakharov hearings. And I will say right away that I agree with Andrei that rejuvenation of Sakharov hearings doesn't seem likely, and perhaps it's not even necessary. And this is the part that I would come to in the conclusion of my remarks. So I will start with telling you that the year 1974, as quite a few other years, is reflected in the diaries, in the collective diaries of my mother, Elena Bonner, and Andrei Sakharov. He started to keep a diary under a lot of pressure from my mother. And the year 1974 opens with an entry about the expulsion of Lydia Chukovskaya and Vladimir Vainovich from the Union of Soviet Writers. It also records a 48-hour search in Kiev in the apartment of Viktor Nekrasov, writer and human rights activist. The entire archive that he amassed throughout the years since World War II was arrested. Then the diary continues with an entry about the arrests of Viktor Nikipelov and Sergei Pirogov, human rights activists and pravozащитники, as we call them, human rights defenders in Soviet Union. And it also marks the beginning of virulent anti-Solzhenitsyn campaign in the Soviet press following the publication of the Gulag Archipelago in the West. This campaign prepared the ground for Solzhenitsyn's arrest on February 12 of 1974 and his expulsion from the Soviet Union the next day. But before the news of his arrival in the West reached Moscow, an appeal that was mentioned by Andrei Grigorenko in support of Solzhenitsyn was ready at the home of my parents. And the Moscow appeal of February 13, 1974 demanded freedom for Solzhenitsyn and the creation of an international tribunal to investigate crimes against humanity committed in the Soviet Union, which were exposed by the Gulag Archipelago. This Moscow appeal was signed by Andrei Sakharov, Elena Bonner, Vladimir Maximov, Mikhail Agursky, Boris Shragin, Pavel Litvinov, who we are honored to have among the founders of our association today, unfortunately, who could not be with us. It was also signed by Yuri Orlov, the founding member of the Moscow-Helsinki group, the first group that signaled the beginning of the worldwide Human Rights Watch. It was signed by Father Sergei Zholutkov, a wonderful Russian Orthodox priest, censored by his own church and subjected to multiple persecutions by the Soviet power and the Soviet allied Russian Orthodox Church. It was also signed by Anatoly Marchenko, the tragic and heroic figure of human rights movement in the Soviet Union, and his wife Larisa Bagaraz. The Moscow appeal original is now housed in the Andrei Sakharov archive in Moscow. Once Solzhenitsyn was free, and in the West, the idea of the tribunal faded away, only surfacing again in the 1990s with the creation of a Memorial Society and the failed Communist Party trial. However, in 1975, as Andrei already mentioned, in October, in Copenhagen, the first international Sakharov hearings took place, focusing on Soviet and Eastern European violations of international human rights standards. Described as one of the most established tools for informing the West about the situation with human rights in the USSR, and that was a quote, I think, from The Guardian, the hearings have varied considerably in breadth and depth. The 75 Copenhagen hearing publicized violations of the final act of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. the Helsinki Declaration. The 77 Rome hearings dealt with Soviet and Eastern European human rights violations. The 1979 Washington, D.C. hearings addressed labor union and workers' rights in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The 1983 Lisbon hearings addressed oppression of creative workers in the Soviet Union and the state of martial law in Poland. The last 1985 London hearings returned to specifics of the Helsinki Declaration, drawing on human rights experts as well as witnesses whose rights were violated and/or denied. The first hearing was the most contentious, politicized, and biased. It was plagued by conflicts between moderates who insisted on the need for objectivity and those with a more explicit political agenda who saw the hearings as an anti-communist operation. This caused Sakharov to voice his concern and criticism. It was also the reason he appointed my late husband, Irina Yankelevich, to look after Sakharov's principles being adhered to and respected. Throughout all the subsequent hearings, Irina played an important organizing and conceptual role, earning respect and admiration of his colleagues and Sakharov's approval and gratitude. Sakharov believed his representatives, I quote, logical mind, knowledge, and absolute integrity ensured the exclusion of any false, unsubstantiated, or sensationalist testimony, and the focus on significant issues. End of quote. It gives me special pleasure today to see Ephraim's friend and Sakharov's hearing comrade in arms, Mario Corti, the force behind the 1977 hearings in Rome. Mario fully embraced Sakharov's vision of the hearings, guiding spirit, and was closely involved in the shaping of subsequent sessions. Sakharov felt that the success of Rome hearings and of the later ones in Washington, Lisbon, and London was due to the integrity and efforts of the organizers, such as Mario Corti and Irina Yankelevich. The organizers arguably saw the hearings as a critical companion to the process initiated by the signing of the Helsinki Final Agreement in 1975. And we can now look back with appreciation at on the imprint of the hearings that in a short 10-year time opened the eyes of the mind and the minds of the free and liberal world to the reality of the lawlessness of Soviet totalitarianism and the defenselessness of an individual before an all-power state. Of ultimate importance to the success and credibility of the hearings, as well as their legitimacy, were several principles pioneered by Sakharov. They were: 1. Exclusion of confrontational Cold Warrior anti-communist rhetoric. 2. Use of human rights language. 3. No witnesses with extremist views, unethical stand, or untrustworthiness. 4. No sensationalist claims. 5. No intolerance, or prejudices. And 6. No propagandistic tone. These principles remain valid today when we face a very different world. Sakharov hearings meant a great deal to me, given the part my family and especially Irina Yankelevich played in the hearings that opened the eyes of the free world to the plight of human rights in the world struggling to become free. Why am I saying all this now, when we face infinitely more ominous challenges to human rights, world peace, and democracy? I want to remind everyone of the Sakharov triad that is now facing unprecedented threat. Sakharov triad was the one that he put together in his Nobel lecture. He put together the interconnectedness and indivisibility of peace, progress, and human rights. None of these is possible without the other two. It is an Sakharov theory of indivisibility of these three components, and it has never been endangered and ignored more than today. So to go back to my question, why am I saying all this today? The threat posed by the Putin regime to the Western democracies, to international stability and peace, to the nation's right of self-determination, and to the very core of fundamental human rights was clear to me early in the beginning of the new millennium, with the coming to power of Vladimir Putin. However, today we face a crisis of totally different proportions. We have to contemplate our responsibility in the context of war crimes and crimes against humanity, unprecedented in Europe since the end of World War II in 1945. And here I want to quote a very controversial person, none other than Leon Trotsky. He said that the greatest historical, philosophical, and psychological work of our time will be written by the Commission of Inquiry. And that's where I want to say that while I agree with Andrei that Sakharov hearings will not be possible to resurrect as such a commission on inquiry, we must continue to work to create a new body. And here I want to invoke the Nuremberg Tribunal, designed not only to punish criminals, but also to deter future crimes. It had to deal with the new horrors of the 20th century. And I want to quote Justice Robert Jackson, chief US prosecutor at Nuremberg, who said in his opening statement, I quote, "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated." End of quote. Non-governmental human rights tribunals proceed from the similar sense of urgency. They extend the spirit of Nuremberg to condemn a wide range of governmental repression as criminal. Non-governmental tribunals resemble the Nuremberg proceedings as they bring charges against government officials, appeal to public opinion, and have to bear tribunal critics. The Nuremberg International Military Tribunal considered 3 charges against Nazi leaders: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Each of the charges, but especially the last, has important human rights implications. Crimes against humanity include, I quote, the tribunal charter, murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhuman acts committed against any civilian population before or during the war, or persecutions on political, racial, or religious grounds. End of quote. All 3 of the crimes the Nazi leaders were charged with are present in the case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The 3rd charge of crimes against humanity is particularly grievous. So let's make it 100% clear. Crimes committed by Russian troops in Bucha, Mariupol, Donetsk, Luhansk, Chernihiv, Bakhmut, these crimes amount to unspeakable, deliberate cruelty and violence against Ukrainian civilians. Rape, murder, other violent acts against people in the Russian forces' custody should be investigated as war crimes. International humanitarian law, or the laws of war, provides protections for civilians and other non-combatants from the hazard of armed conflict. Civilians may never be deliberate target of attacks. Non-governmental tribunals are tribunals of conscience, and their legitimacy depends upon public reaction. If we are successful in our efforts to document and condemn crimes against humanity committed by Russian armed forces in Ukraine, the public will assume legal and moral responsibility to keep Nuremberg alive. This will be done through tribunals in which principles derived from war crimes proceedings are applied to the cases of human rights violations. And in closing, let me say, in today's efforts to keep Sakharov's legacy alive, the work of our association is essential for laying the groundwork for the future tribunal of crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. And this is the title I propose: Tribunal of Crimes Committed by Russia in Ukraine. There is no doubt in my mind that this work is absolutely necessary for the worldwide effort to help Ukraine rebuild the country and the Ukrainian citizens to rebuild their lives, but also for the citizens of Russia to face Russia's and their own horrific past and to assume their civic and human responsibility.
I just want to emphasize, as Tatiana mentioned, our association. I know of no other platform in the Russian-speaking Russian immigrant community that will be open to for anyone to come, listen, participate, and speak and be heard.
Thank you also to all the participants. I was really impressed by the remarks that were made and found them extremely informative, often, and very moving. Thank you very much for your work, Dmitri.
Thank you all. Please send us your written remarks if you have, and have a great rest of the day and the weekend.
Goodbye.